Jonathan, Rob, and Trevor, many thanks for laying out the framework, introducing everybody to the book. We hope you all read the book and now are incentivized to do so. And the floor is open for questions, comments, and observations on all of the above.
Can I ask our guests a question to start?
Sure.
When I read the first draft of this study, much of what Trevor and Rob just presented surprised me, and I follow this stuff every day. Were you surprised by these facts? This is not what we assumed to be the case, is it? But the legislation is moving based on the assumptions that we all brought in the room, not what they just explained.
All right, so we make that a requirement for everybody who gets up to ask a question or give an observation. You first have to answer Jonathan's question of whether you found this new and surprising. Okay, with that caveat, the floor is open. Yeah, Bill, please go to the mic and introduce yourself, and so we know where you're coming from.
Bill Klein from here at the Institute. Trevor and Rob, congratulations on a very useful study. I wonder if there's a...
Were you surprised? That's a loaded question.
Well, I'm not sure. What I wonder, I mean, it's you sort of presented two approaches to this. One is to sort of level the playing field. The other is to provide an incentive to get to the table. And I think it's fair to say that the incentive, I call this sort of the cruise missile approach to trade policy. You know, instead of sending a cruise missile to wipe out a country that won't play ball on global warming, you do really punitive stuff. And as you say, with sanctions, all experiences, that's not going to work. So I think to some extent, I wouldn't look at it that way. But then you get the question, what is the right way to think about how high the levy should be to essentially get the right price globally for carbon? There should be, the objective should essentially be to have a worldwide price for carbon that reflects the negative externalities. And to do that, I'm not sure at all that what you want to do is to set up a regime that's, I think you basically want sort of a binary regime. A country's either not facing any penalties because it's not cooperating. Magnitude of those penalties should also be binary. It shouldn't be tailored, well, this country is not cooperating, but since it uses hydro, that's not a problem, so there's no penalty. Because at the margin, what happens is that you push industries to shift their new dirty production around the world to in non-participating countries. That simplifies the whole approach quite a bit, because you need for each industry basically a carbon content of the dirtiest production method around the globe, and that would be the default tariff schedule, sort of like the old, you know, communist country schedule 2. If you look at it this way, it seems to me it simplifies matters somewhat from the countless different colors of, you know, is it intensive in carbon? Principle is A, to make sure price of this B, that not give a country the benefit of the doubt that there's sort of a standard marginal dirty cost. It seems to me that might be a more useful way to look at the strategy.
Thanks, Bill. I think the challenge is that you're right that we have to separate incentives for developing countries to participate in climate negotiations more broadly, and the question of how do you create a level playing field and prevent leakage emissions. We have a process in place for the former. We have a process in place to come up with what is comparable and fair and equitable in terms of climate policy, and that's the UNFCCC and the post-Kyoto negotiations. It's obviously not an easy question, otherwise those negotiations wouldn't be difficult. On the trade side, the challenges, and we go into this in quite a bit of depth in the book, is that coming up with the right price to set on a box of steel or a box of cement or a box of aluminum at the border just by opening it and looking at it is quite challenging. Now, if you have an agreement that includes other countries where you can come to terms with what the appropriate price should be, there's a way to build a monitoring and verification apparatus within each country to accurately assess embedded carbon. But if we're only doing it at the border, it's very difficult to do it accurately. That's problematic on two fronts. It's problematic in that it doesn't create the right incentives, because if you're a Chinese steel firm and you're the best in class, you're a Bao Steel, let's say, and your carbon intensity of production is half that of your peer competitors inside China that are dirtier. If once your good gets to the U.S. border, it's assessed at an aggregate nationwide level, then you have no incentive to improve the carbon footprint of your production because you're not going to be rewarded for doing it. So you create a situation where the best in class have no incentive to get better and the worst in class have an incentive to stay right where they are. Now, if you have trade measures as part of a multilateral agreement and tailored to a firm level, then I think you can create positive incentives at an individual firm level to improve the carbon intensity of production, even if you can't compel a change in national policy.
Thank you. I was surprised.
Identify.
Because
Identify.
Oh, I'm Frank Loy.
And what did you do in '97?
I went to all those conferences that Rob was talking about constantly, and actually got some things done, which, for better or worse, ended up in the current Kyoto Agreement, which in the end was adopted because the U.S. was out of it, I suppose you could say. However, my question is this. You made a very strong case that the proposed measures that are in some of the bills that we're talking about would be ineffective both in terms, because there isn't enough export from China to the U.S. or high in carbon intensity export to really affect that, and the incentive wouldn't be very great because they would have other markets that they could deal with. And lastly, we were actually in the end maybe going to be the victims of similar action by the European. Okay, I accept that. My question is, let us assume, as a lot of people do assume, that the United States domestic requirement is that there be trade protection in the U.S. legislation. That is so, even if it is even if the risk is overdrawn, and even if the measures may not be as effective as the framers think.
Mechanisms in U.S. policy design would do a better job of leveling the playing field for U.S. industry than trade measures that are conditioned on an assessment of whether foreign countries have taken comparable action on climate policy based on an administrative review. Assessing what comparable climate policy is a difficult affair. Dealing with, from the start, making sure that climate policy costs on trade-exposed industries were mitigated would, from day one, provide relief for those industries. On the second side, our view is that instead of creating incentives for countries like China and India to participate in international negotiations, the threat of trade measures may, in fact, reduce the likelihood of reaching such an agreement that could, in fact, poison the well. And if that, in fact, is the case, and this is the game of kind of high-stakes poker that we're playing, then we really have shot ourselves in the foot, since we do need ultimately action by China and India to get to where we need to be. There's a number of other options for engaging those countries, many of which are already underway, and maybe Rob can speak about more.
Yeah, I think as Trevor says, separating these two issues is really important. And I think, certainly, Frank, you'll be very familiar with some of the international dynamics that help us perhaps try and understand a little bit better how our international partners might respond to some of these options. And there would be a fair amount of outrage First of all, of course, the idea at any time soon that a U.S. administration would be setting itself up as the arbiter of who is naughty and who is nice on international climate policy would have the advantage of dispelling all this loose talk about Americans having no sense of irony, but would really command very little else in the way of building bridges and making friends. The United States has been the principal drag on international climate policy over the last 7 or 8 years. Stepping up to a leadership role does not mean on day one essentially dragging the feet until much, much poorer countries come along. And that takes us to the second point, which it's deeply reflected in international climate agreements that there is a principle of what is known as common but differentiated responsibilities. And if you're India and you have a per capita GDP of something like a 20th of what it is in the United States, an emissions per capita of about a 15th of what it is in the United States, you don't tend to respond very well to the idea that you immediately need to be bullied into the negotiating table. So I think we need to be realistic about what will and will not get a positive response out of some of the international partners there. To come back to your initial question, though, I think it is generally accepted, and I think we would accept the political logic which says that you will not get a bill passed in Washington in the next couple of years without something that protects policymakers from their big fear, which is that any business in the United States, and certainly in these sensitive industries, will be able to point to a plant and say, I closed this down and moved to China because of your bill. So the question is, how do you deal with that? Well, one way is to try indirectly to impose these costs on foreign producers, but the other is to help manage the cost on the US producers. And I think where we see somewhat more promise, and certainly with the performance-based benchmarking that Trevor was referring to, is on some method for relieving that cost. Essentially, the idea that's being floated at the moment, and it's at a relatively rudimentary stage of debate, is that in some way, either by reallocating auctioning revenues or by placing some kind of free allocation of the allowances within the system, but within a sector on the basis of an efficiency benchmark, you would set on a sector-wide basis essentially reimburse the industry for its cost of compliance. Because that's done on an efficiency benchmark, you're still advantaging efficient producers relative to inefficient producers within those sectors. But in terms of the overall cost profile relative to international producers, you are avoiding disadvantaging them excessively on the international market. That process does have a couple of drawbacks. In particular, in the long run, we do want to create a regime in which more energy-intensive products and carbon-intensive products are inherently just more expensive, and that would have an impact on the demand for those products. And certainly, there's a fear that it might act as a disincentive on the part of some of those sectors for actually engaging constructively in international agreements. But if one views that as an interim measure that is able to tide us over some of the big political obstacles to a national policy, as a precursor to what is clearly the desirable intermediate stage, which is that we engage on a sectoral basis in some of those sensitive areas, and then the longer-term goal, which is to try, as Bill was suggesting earlier, to pull everybody into a more comprehensive regime. But in our view, that creates a somewhat more reasonable-looking roadmap to that desirable end goal.
I just wanted to add something. The discussion seems to have taken a turn that makes it sound as if action on climate change is extremely unpleasant medicine that we have to take for the sake of the children, and if we're going to take this nasty medicine, we'll be damned if everybody else shouldn't take it at the same time. There's every indication that for an economy that is as entrepreneurial and innovative as ours, this is the bridge to tomorrow's markets. It is a major opportunity for the U.S. to reassert economic leadership in selling what tomorrow's markets will be buying. If you look at it in that context, the strongest incentives for China have nothing to do with whether we'll place punitive levies on 2% of their exports. It has much more to do with supply chain pressures and opportunities to sell into tomorrow's markets. I see every evidence that the Chinese are acutely aware of those two things. They see the pressure that is from their customers in the U.S. and in Europe, and they see which industries in China are growing fastest. I mean, the example of Suntech, their manufacturer of solar photovoltaics, which is becoming the largest in the world this year, is a very strong example for them. They know they won't achieve their economic goals without being able to sell into low-carbon markets. We should take advantage of that.
As a total non-expert on this, I inject a substantive comment only with trepidation, but to draw a lesson from history. We do have experience from the history of trade policy on the same issue that's being debated here. Do you try to maintain a level playing field by erecting import restraints, or do you support the domestic competitor directly? The record from the history of trade policy, crystal clear. Gary Huffbauer here and others have done multiple studies that show that trying to protect a domestic industry and its jobs through border barriers almost never works. In fact, is frequently counterproductive. See steel and autos in this country in the 1970s and 1980s. By contrast, direct supports tailored to the problems of a given industry or even firm or even community, call it adjustment assistance under one heading or another, can be much more effective. And so as we go into a new regime, I would hope we would learn from the record of the past, draw the proper inferences here, and try to tailor those domestic aids in a creative and innovative way, as the authors of this study have just suggested. Okay, a lot of people. Steve.
Thank you. Steve Charnovich, George Washington University. In answer to Fred's point about was I surprised, I would say no, because I think the finding on the significance of what used to be called polluter havens follows what the evidence was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and work done at the Institute on that question in the trade and environment context. And as far as the efficacy of trade sanctions, I think one would not expect them to be very effective, and that also follows from work that's been done in the past. My question, and this follows what Mr. Lash just said about the broader picture. Aren't you using a rather, a very narrow definition of competitiveness? I didn't see a definition in the book, either in the text or in the glossary. But it seemed to me what you're talking about is the competitiveness of a particular industry in world trade, like non-ferrous metals or ferrous metals. And I wonder what the relationship between the health of our ferrous metals industry is with U.S. prosperity or U.S. income growth. What's happening with American families? That you're focusing quite, appropriately, I think, on particular industries because maybe that's what the domestic debate is now, but missing the bigger picture that Mr. Lash just talked about of what the whole system would look like in terms of a climate change and economic policy. And the output-based rebates, to me, is another word for subsidies. And it's one thing, as Fred Berkston notes, to have adjustment assistance and subsidies for workers. But I'm puzzled about the notion of adjustment assistance subsidies for the ferrous metal industry. How that would fit into a bigger, prosperity economic analysis picture. I have a hard time crosswalking the concept of competitiveness in the study, which is very narrow, with what people are really concerned about, I think, in terms of the political campaign now, of American prosperity.
I think, first of all, in the spirit of plugging our new partnership, one of the areas to which we will next be turning is precisely this question of the broader issue of competitiveness, and particularly what we've been thinking of as the positive trade agenda. So as Jonathan's been outlining, there's in fact an enormous range of opportunity here, and this is a very familiar narrative to those who have worked in the trade space, that, of course, of so many of these economic transformations involve huge gains that you can't point to yet, and perhaps even relatively minor losses, but from somebody holding a placard in your office. And so balancing those two agendas is something that I think we're very interested in understanding a little bit more closely. To be blunt, the politics of competitiveness are a completely different question from the economics of competitiveness. And so we dealt with a set of sectors that are essentially, the choice is driven by some of the political dynamics, I think primarily, although we identified a methodology by which we would sort of classify sectors as particularly vulnerable in that space. That is not big news to many of the policymakers, because those are the people who are sitting in their offices right now. And I think certainly as we think about this in terms of what certainly for many of us is an overriding priority to bring the United States back to a position of leadership on taking action on climate change, a critical question is how you overcome that fundamental political obstacle that is causing so much heartburn for US legislators. I agree that I think if we were thinking about this not as a question of getting over a political hurdle in order to secure a bill, but as something more broadly to promote the economic and social well-being of the United States, we would not be seeking to find ways to prop up the steel industry. It's very interesting that China, which has very urgent and desperate problems of social cohesion and the need for job creation, is in fact turning away from the steel industry because it turns out it's not a great way to generate employment and welfare.
I just add, thanks for the question, Steve. It's the right question. And we have, in Chapter 1, we should have a little passage that says what we mean by competitiveness, where we raise that point exactly, that this is a very narrow view of competitiveness. And we're talking about the impacts on 3% of U.S. GDP and the impact on the U.S. economy as a whole on the positive side as well as the negative side is a much bigger question. And that's one of the subsequent pieces of work that we hope to delve into when we have more time to do it. This piece was a little responsive to some of the current policy questions, but that's absolutely the right question to deal with. On the question about subsidies as a part of output-based rebating, all of the cost containment provisions being contemplated currently, from free allocation of emission allowances to tax credits to output-based rebating, they all raise questions in this realm, right? If it's a political mandate to do something about the cost for these industries, then it's a range of imperfect outcomes. And the point that we make is for the stated objectives as well as the health of the trading system, we think that you can get there better through some of these measures that will be less distortive than through unilateral border adjustments.
Just to add one point, Steve has quite properly raised the general equilibrium question. And there's one other dimension of it, as I sit here in my green suit today. Are we measuring welfare correctly by using GDP numbers? That's what we use in all of our calculations. But of course, the basic argument that GDP numbers ignore sustainability and environmental issues comes to the fore. Because if you have a different denominator in the equation and a different delta in that denominator as a result of your climate change policy, the sign of your result could be totally different. And so as we do the more elaborate, more extensive work, we of course want to think in those broader terms as well. Yeah, right here.
Joel Yudkin, High Road Strategies. I'm doing a study, in fact, on climate policy's impact on manufacturing, especially these sectors that you're looking at. And sure enough, the policies like the Lieberman-Warner, and to a lesser extent the Bingman, there's going to be a cost impact on these different sectors we're talking about. And the question I think that is coming up is to what extent what are the mitigating policies or approaches that will allow these industries to adjust to these cost impacts on their, and we're seeing the increase in costs, diminishment of their profits, and also depending if you use a cost pass along or no cost pass along, impact on their market share. But the bottom line is that you have industries that that have to adjust to some increased costs that are due to these rising energy prices that are tied to these policies. And the question is, how do, their ability to make that adjustment is very problematic right now. I mean, that's why I'm wondering, I have my own concerns about the trade adjustment, mechanism and whether that would work. You mentioned other mechanisms, but in most of these sectors, you have anywhere from 0.25% to maybe a few percent per year incremental improvement in energy efficiency that may be possible to offset this. Most of them are looking at that they might have to invest quite a bit, big step jumps in new technology and investment in order to be able to compensate for what, by 2020, 2030, could be significant losses in their bottom line. If they don't make those, that would be offsetting. So some of these mitigating policies, like what maybe you're talking about, Fred, could be to give time for these industries to be able to be in a position and the technologies to be available so those investments would start to pay off, and what do they do in the meantime. But in the meantime, we may be in a situation where, especially the more marginal parts of those industries, would be faced with, well, we may move overseas rather than invest, because they will be forced with some choice along those lines. And I'm just wondering about, we haven't really looked at the question of the trade border adjustment, but Fred, I was a little surprised you were talking about essentially industrial policy, dirty word in this town, to be able to adjust to this. I'm not against it personally, but I think that there needs to be, we have an opportunity here perhaps for like the allocation allowances or some large pots of money that could be driven by these policies that we could be funneling into that, because it has a greater public good, not just the service of those industries.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it industrial policy, which tends to have a more offensive, in two senses, offensive connotation. You're trying to pick winners and give them support so they'll enhance their role. This is more defensive, to try to mitigate, as you suggested, the adverse impact on particular sectors. There is a political dynamic in the U.S., for better or worse, that historically, when a policy has been adopted for broad national interest purposes, but some specific groups have been disadvantaged, to tailor a program for them to cushion their adjustment. When the railroads were nationalized in the early 70s, we had a special program of adjustment assistance, call it that, for railroad workers, and I think to some extent for firms. So you could imagine climate change adjustment assistance, which addressed to firms, but particularly workers adversely affected by this structural change, which is in the interest of the country as a whole, to cushion the adverse effects. You'd have to figure out how to do that. I would certainly want to condition it on adjustment strategies undertaken by the firms and the industries themselves, so that over time they did get off the dole. But that's, again, for better or worse, that's a tried and true component of U.S. policy when undertaking structural change, and it's something we'll probably want to look at in more detail as we proceed with our further work.
Let me just add one point on that, Joel. A little clarification on output-based rebating in particular, and that it's different than a trade adjustment assistance, this type of proposal, and that what it does is it rebates the exact cost of climate policy on a given firm at the end of the year. And that is done at a sector average. So if you're a firm and you produce the same amount of steel better than your competitors, then you get a modest windfall, right? If you produce the same amount of steel a little worse than your competitors, then you pay some cost. But if you're average, on industry average, you essentially have no carbon cost placed on you. And so as an intermediate step, that would keep the U.S. industry at exactly the same place it is today in terms of international competitiveness, with some new incentives to get cleaner at the margins while we transition to a international agreement that imposes comparable costs on other producers.
Bennett Johnston with Johnston and Associates. I was very surprised by this. I thought the trick was how to make your tariffs WTO consistent, and how to defend yourself against the threat from the Chinese of getting out of the dollar. So I wonder, what are our sanctions? What is it that's going to compel the Chinese? I mean, I look on page 65 here, and I see where the projection is that they're going to double their, or at least the projection is a doubling of carbon output. I see where the IEA projects 174% increase in coal in China between now and 2030. I see last year where they added 28 times as much coal as we added wind in the United States. And I see hundreds of millions of Chinese that are looking for a better life. Just how do we get the Chinese to be part of this regime which the world so badly needs?
Let me jump in, Senator Johnston, and then let Rob add to that. Of course, that's the key question. China and the U.S. are the crux of this question. The world will reach agreement if China and the U.S. find a way where our joint interests are served by entering an international agreement. I think we should be satisfied if we achieve an agreement in which the Chinese commit in their next 5-year plan to go significantly beyond what they've committed in the current 5-year plan in terms of energy efficiency, carbon intensity, and in the plan after that to reach an absolute stabilization of emissions and start down. I think that's not out of the question. I think there are several pressures that are operating on China now that we can take advantage of. The one, as I said, is the supply chain pressure. Their customers will be making reductions. The second is tomorrow's markets. They know tomorrow's markets will be carbon constrained, and if their internal platform doesn't provide the opportunity for their companies to sell within China low carbon products, they are disadvantaged selling outside of China. The third is what Rob presented very compellingly. They will be profoundly affected by climate change. I was stunned to find top Chinese leaders who can quote from the IPCC studies far better than U.S. leaders on the impacts on China. The fourth is that because they are the largest source of emissions in the world now, because they depend on global trade, they have become, in a way that we've never experienced before, a nation conscious of their role in the world. And I think that if we deal with them understanding that they see themselves as a great power economically, we can reach the agreement in which they take a commitment to make reductions. But I think that superficial clubs wielded by the Congress are going to undermine that process, not help it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the notion that trade or indeed almost anything else that's available to the U.S. policymaker toolkit is enough to coerce China to do climate policy or, frankly, anything else is a fantasy. And it's a fantasy that's often indulged, but it's something that I think we need to be a little bit more clear-eyed about. I think in addition to the fact that China has an important vested interest in making sure that the world together moves forward on multilateral approaches to climate change, because they're frankly going to get it in the neck a lot worse than the United States is, at least in the first instance. And they're fully aware of the fact. Secondly, China has an enormous interest in what we've been referring to as this broader positive economic transformation that's going to need to happen. It's absolutely true that China is putting up what we think of as traditional infrastructure at an astounding rate. But China is also emerging into some of these new technology economies at an equally impressive rate. And I think if we look back at some of the major technological revolutions that have happened over the last few decades, they have happened, in fact, not in one country or another, but by the emergence of industries with global reach and global supply chains. The IT revolution, much as it may have had much of its inspiration in California, nevertheless, a lot of the kit is made in East Asia. It's marketed and supported in India. These are global supply chains and global approaches, and China wants to be a part of that every bit as much as everybody else. So we have some real potential here, I think, to engage on a more positive agenda. And again, I think we need to just be a little bit more realistic about the potential for us to be coercive in this space.
Let me add just one point on that. My colleague Dan Rosen and I have done quite a bit of work on China's energy sector, and there's a report we have that speaks to some of this. And I think actually China's an easier case than India in this regard. And that's because a lot of what we would like to see is in China's economic interest anyway, that we're not putting to China a binary choice between economic growth and environmental protection. Those 5 industries that I threw up there on the board in China, while they only account for 6% of emissions here in the U.S., they account for nearly half of emissions in China, right? And those 5 industries combined only employ 14 million people in a country of 1.3 billion. So if you need to create 20 million new jobs each year to deal with restructured state-owned enterprises and rural to urban migration, iron and steel, aluminum and cement is not the way you want to go. And so this has become part of the broader rebalancing economic growth debate that our colleague Nick Lardy writes on often. There's a number of steps. World Bank has done some modeling on this that China is already looking to take that could keep economic growth at the same level today, but reduce energy demand and thus CO2 emissions 25% by 2030 off of the baseline of today's growth, just by rebalancing economic growth. Final note, just one word of caution in how we think about Chinese emissions. The projection from the last International Energy Agency outlook, the one that we have in the chart, the big scary China line going out to 2030. That line is about 79% higher than it was just 5 years ago in that projection. And that wasn't because China's economy grew faster than we expected necessarily. It grew a little faster. But it was a change in the structure of economic growth. The government's actively trying to change that structure back in the other way now. And if they're successful in doing that, you could see a similar downside surprise on the projection that we have today. Thanks.
Jack, final question.
Jack Rifkin, I'm Chief Investment Officer at Neuberger Berman. We're certainly interested in the issue, but pragmatically we tend to bring this down to what does it mean for investing and how does one invest. And number one, I would make the point that we see an enormous investment opportunity here coming out of both the technological developments that will take place and also some of the relocations or dislocations that will occur. But to some extent, I bring this back to this issue which you brought up, Trevor. First, I would say I wasn't surprised by this, but that's only because I spend way too much time with Trevor. But I'm always shocked by the lack of magnitude of these numbers in these particular industries. And it kind of gets to this questions on the labor front. You talked about China and labor. This is even a smaller portion of our labor force than it is of the emissions that we're producing from these segments. And these, for the most part, except for some segments of the chemical industry, are yesterday's industries. And it's not like they're going to move overseas. They're going to lose market share. As opposed, China is not interested in having a U.S. manufacturer relocate in China. They can take over that production with their own plants. So it's the loss of jobs that will occur as we continue to lose market share. And that seems to me to be the focus, and it's not a very big one. But you have some data on this, but I think it'd be useful to hear a little bit more about that. And then secondly, you talk about China and the U.S. It's an internal creation of emissions. It's emissions that are being created for what's going on within the countries as opposed to what's happening in an export sense. And we have the whole power industry to deal with, which is not really dealt with in this instance. But I'd be interested in your comments on where does the power industry stand on this relative to the noises that are being made by these yesterday's industries on protecting themselves?
One point quick and then pass it to Rob. You can tell that Jack's from New York because he feels happy standing up at a table in D.C. and calling the steel industry yesterday's industry. I don't know if anyone in D.C. would make that comment. The labor question is the right one, Jack. I mean, that's the linchpin here, and I think that there's kind of two parts of it. There's how do we design climate policy in a way that there's upside for U.S. employment and other industries? And then the flip side is, how do we make sure that, to the extent that we target assistance to domestic producers in those industries, that assistance comes in the form of maintaining employment? A lot of the types of cost containment measures, and we discuss this in the book, some types of free allocation, don't necessarily create incentives to maintain employment. They create incentives for firms to book profit over market share. And that's an issue, is this policy is being designed that's critical to look at. You want to speak to electric power?
I wasn't necessarily going to speak to electric power as such. I mean, I think Trevor's point is right, and the basic fact that these sectors play a relatively minor role in U.S. employment and in the economy is absolutely correct. The fact that what we are dealing here is actually a fairly small influence on what is a lot bigger set of trends in those same industries as they relocate around the world is also true. And to a certain extent, these are the truths that dare not speak their name in U.S. politics. Standing in a legislator's office and saying, listen, you needn't worry about this too much because this is a relatively small set of sectors, it's still the set of sectors that's mobilizing votes in given constituencies and on which individual communities are in many cases highly dependent. And so it's a legitimate political concern for a legislator to worry about. Certainly our point, though, about the scale has been not it's small, therefore it doesn't matter, but it's small, therefore you can deal with it through some targeted measures that don't necessarily mean you taking a sledgehammer to climate policy by turning it either into a protection fest or by limiting the impact of prices of carbon on the rest of the economy, which can respond much more effectively. So certainly, I think it's important for us to keep perspective on this issue, but within the narrow world of getting some of this important legislation moving in Washington, it's, if you like, a fact of life that has come to be accepted. I would like to just hark back one more time, since this is our last round of questions, to the way you opened your question, which is, again, the fact that those who are actually thinking about where investment is really going to happen, where the jobs are really going to be created, are not looking at these sectors. It's very difficult to argue to a US policymaker, well, it's okay because you were never going to build another aluminium smelter in the United States anyway. But that is, in fact, the case. And so work that we've been undertaking in WRI and that we're looking forward to undertaking further in partnership with the Peterson Institute, and in particular that my colleague Britt Childs, one of our co-authors, has been taking forward, has been specifically about that, working with the investment community, your own firm and some of your competitors, looking precisely at where the exciting opportunities are for ramping up investment, creating jobs, creating new economic growth within the United States. And all of those spaces right now are in the kinds of technologies that are going to be impelled by climate policy. And that's, I think, a very exciting dimension. We see this as this set of concerns around energy-intensive industries as something we need to essentially get out of the way in order to make climate policy move. It's not where I think the conversation needs to be focused in the years to come. We, in fact, have a tremendous opportunity to be seized.
Jonathan, final words?
I just want to go back to where we started. I think most of us come into this discussion with a set of mistaken assumptions about where the problems are in reducing CO2 emissions in the U.S. economy. It's going to be very hard, but we shouldn't adopt policies that solve the wrong problem.
Let me thank Jonathan, particularly thank Trevor, Rob, and their co-authors for presenting this study to us today. I want to thank all of you for coming. Reiterate that this is only the first installment. We will have more on this topic over the coming months and years. We look forward to continuing the dialogue with you. Thanks to the authors in particular. Meeting adjourned.